The White House is one of the most recognizable houses in the world, but just how many White Houses have there been? What could it have looked like, and where else did presidents run the country from? Hi everyone, Ken here. Today we are exploring the many renditions of the White House. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode of This House. Following his inauguration in 1789, President George Washington made his residence in two separate private homes in New York City, which at the time functioned as the nation's executive residences. Initially, he settled into the Franklin House at No. 3 Cherry Street, a property owned by Samuel Osgood, who was the Treasury Commissioner. He resided there until the end of February of 1790. Subsequently, the executive mansion was relocated to a more spacious accommodation at the Alexander Macomb House on Broadway. Here, Washington, alongside his wife Martha and a modest entourage, stayed until August of 1790. During May of the same year, plans were set in motion for the construction of a new official residence in Manhattan, known as Government House. However, Washington never had the opportunity to reside in Government House. The nation's capital was transferred to Philadelphia in 1790, where it would stay until 1800. This move was a result of the Residence Act passed in July of 1790, which temporarily established the capital in Philadelphia for a decade, with a long-term plan to relocate it to a newly designated federal district. In Philadelphia, the government leased a mansion belonging to merchant Robert Morris located at 190 High Street to serve as the President's house. Given the mansion's limited space, which had to accommodate Washington's extensive household which had grown to about 30 people, he had the building expanded. John Adams, Washington's successor and the second President of the United States, took up residence in the High Street mansion from 1797 until 1800. Even though Philadelphia had initiated the construction of a more opulent presidential mansion, which was almost finished by Adams' inauguration in 1797, Adams refrained from moving in, citing a lack of congressional approval to lease the property. Meanwhile, back when Washington was still the president, he and his Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson began planning a more permanent executive residence. They decided that in the spirit of democracy, they would hold a competition in which the people would be allowed to design the president's house. This design competition caught the attention of some of the most well-known architects of the era, but the final decision boiled down to just 9 finalists. Some of the proposed designs were palatial and ostentatious, while others were more refined. Ultimately, it was not a tough decision, and James Hoban, an architect of Irish-American heritage, emerged victorious. While Hoban's design for what would eventually be called the White House might seem the most familiar, it ultimately would not stand the test of time. Construction started in 1792 and stretched on for 8 long years as artisans added finishing touches, including whitewashing the sandstone facade to give the White House its iconic appearance. John Adams became the first president to call 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue home, but the nation was still dealing with the British. In the midst of the War of 1812, the White House fell victim to a devastating fire set by British troops in 1814, an event that was part of the broader burning of Washington. This aggressive act was a reprisal for the American forces' raids in Canadian territories. The fire wreaked havoc across much of the capital, severely damaging the White House. Post-fire, the structure was largely gutted, with only its outer walls left standing. These remnants were so weakened by the fire's ferocity and the subsequent weather exposure that almost all had to be demolished and rebuilt, save for a portion of the south wall. The burn marks were covered over by white paint, finally giving the executive residence the nickname White House. At this time, James Madison was serving as the president and had to move into the Octagon House while the White House was being repaired. He lived in the stately mansion for just 6 months, and though it was not as large nor as opulent as the executive residence had been, the federal-style mansion was still graciously appointed and revered as a stately residence suitable for a president, and it served its purpose well. The president's lease of the Octagon House was only meant to be temporary. In 1815, Madison moved to the 7 Buildings, a collection of some of the oldest homes in D.C., where he would serve the remainder of his presidency. During this time, Hoban collaborated with the designer of the U.S. Capitol building, Benjamin Latrobe, to rebuild the White House. This time, it would be given more attention to detail with intricate relief work depicting roses near the column's capitals. The interior was lavishly furnished with richly colored textiles to convey the nation's wealth and permanence. The White House was classically styled both inside and out, placing itself in a position to not only compete on the world stage, but to play host to kings and queens, among other foreign dignitaries. This version of the White House stood proudly, mostly unchanged for decades until President Chester Arthur took the oath of office in 1881. By now, the Palladian and neoclassical interiors were viewed largely as being outdated. Arthur had every item in the White House discarded without any thought for historical significance save 2 busts which he chose to reuse. He then hired famed designer Louis Comfort Tiffany to completely reimagine the White House. Tiffany was known for his stained glass work, which he incorporated throughout the White House, including a 50-foot-long stained glass screen embedded with gems to greet visitors in the entrance hall. The Red Room was transformed into the Pomeranian Red Room, with both silver and copper stars worked into the ceiling's design. The Blue Room was refinished with metallic geometric tracery lining the ceiling and walls, with brightly colored floral carpets surrounding the opalescent fireplace. Furthermore, rooms were covered in gold leaf and faux marbling to give the White House an appearance more akin to the then popular Victorian-era mansions of the ultra-wealthy. This appearance did not sit well with President Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1902 hired the famed Gilded Age architecture firm of McKim, Mead & White to return the White House to its classical roots, doing away with its Victorian influence. The renovations were extensive both inside and outside of the White House, as Charles McKim led the project to not only bring back a refined and classical aesthetic, but to modernize the functionality of the White House. Fleeting were the days of horses and buggies, so the grounds were updated to receive deliveries by automobiles. The newly built West Wing was ready to be staffed, which freed up much-needed space inside the White House, not only to enlarge rooms, but to give the first family more privacy in their living quarters. Roosevelt was a man of refined taste and recognized the importance of Louis Comfort Tiffany's work, so he carefully had the screen dismantled and auctioned off. This allowed for Charles McKim to completely redesign the entrance hall, which we will see after passing through the vestibule. Tried and true motifs were used to decorate the new entrance hall, giving it an air of timelessness. Though it was not without detail, as we can notice the intricate relief work found in the frieze, a signature of the architect, in the center of the White House. The Blue Room was toned down, allowing American-made furnishings and fixtures to speak to the quality of the nation's production. The East Room, continuing these classically inspired elements, was clad in wall panels marked by fluted pilasters. Large crystal chandeliers were suspended from an ornate plaster ceiling, while gilded accents were confined to the smallest of details to convey only whispers of excess. Instead of overly personalized objects d'art, the Red Room was not meant to distract, but rather to frame and call attention to portraits of previous presidents and first ladies. Though it wasn't all so impersonal. The state dining room, finished in rich wood paneling with an elaborate plaster ceiling, displayed the president's prized trophies where he could bond with other leaders and plan hunts, events which helped solidify the nation's good standing with a sense of camaraderie among nations. The first floor continued on, with several more refined and elegant rooms, including the Yellow Oval Room. But we can skip ahead to the grand staircase, guarded by a bronze screen, to see the more private quarters of the first family. The bifurcated staircase splits at its landing, taking us towards the second floor hall, which was made to feel more homey, with wood floors below plush rugs and plenty of natural light pouring in through skylights above potted plants. At this time, the Queen's bedroom, as it is commonly referred to, was known as the Rose Room, and what would eventually be called the Lincoln Sitting Room served as the guest bedroom. For the first time, an east wing was constructed to flank the White House at the end of Thomas Jefferson's earlier colonnade. The McKim, Mead & White redesign of the White House was an instant success with critics. Around this time, there were more items that needed to be addressed with the White House. Even with the addition of a West Wing, space was limited. There were proposed additions which would have forever reshaped the White House beyond recognition, but in the end, more subtle wings were added to preserve its now iconic form. Though, not every iconic piece of the White House had been placed yet. President William Howard Taft commissioned architect Nathan C. Wyeth to double the size of the West Wing, adding subterranean levels, but perhaps most culturally significant, this expansion included the first Oval Office in 1909. It was styled to be cohesive with the rest of the complex, including Georgian Revival millwork and a simple marble fireplace mantel. Unfortunately, it was damaged by fire 2 decades later in 1929. Several more renovations took place over the years, including the addition of a 4th story above the White House by President Calvin Coolidge. After Franklin D. Roosevelt became president, he had the Oval Office completely redesigned, with additional offices planned in subterranean basements to be built out and under the White House lawn. Roosevelt, who relied on a wheelchair, hired architect Eric Gugler to ensure that he could comfortably get around. Not only that, but he would restyle the Oval Office to include built-in bookcases, recessed lighting, and incorporate the presidential seal in the center of the ceiling. By the 1940s, the White House had been rebuilt from a burnt-out husk, renovated dozens of times, walls had been moved, basements and sub-basements had been dug out under the house and lawn, and due to so many renovation projects with such a large number of designers who did not communicate with each other, the entire structure was essentially on the verge of collapse. In 1948, at the cost of $5.7 million, or the modern-day equivalent of about $72 million, President Truman had the White House completely gutted. Once all the interiors were removed, the facade was braced and steel beams were installed to replace the former wood supports. Though an effort was made to remove some of the older, more delicate features to be reinstalled later, most of the ornate plasterwork and paneling were damaged beyond repair in the process of removing them. The general layout of the White House remained about the same. However, once it was completed in 1952, critics called the finishes generic. The new White House was exactly that. It was new. There was no history left between its walls. The White House was no longer viewed as a palatial residence, it was just the president's house with an unremarkable interior. When JFK arrived in the White House, First Lady Jackie Kennedy immediately got to work creating a more appropriate White House. She hired leading designers such as Henry Francis DuPont to create period rooms which ranged from Louis XVI to Federal style. Her exhaustive work transforming the White House from a plain series of rooms to a residence that emulated historical significance garnered her much-deserved accolades. Just as it had been in the early days, and again under Theodore Roosevelt, the White House was once again an architecturally respectable establishment. In conjunction with her restoration efforts, Congress named the White House a museum, with historical protections to ensure that its furnishings, architectural elements, and collections would be protected for future generations. Instead of allowing presidents to renovate the White House on a whim, there is now a committee to oversee and approve any changes outside of the first family's private quarters. Even with protections in place, the White House continued to evolve and change with further renovations of staterooms by both the Reagans and the Clintons. More recently, only minor changes have been made. Aside from tennis courts, gardens, and seasonal decorations, the staterooms have remained mostly unaltered in recent years. The narrative of the White House is a vivid illustration of the nation's history, reflecting both its challenges and triumphs. As we look to the future, the White House remains a symbol of the American presidency, embodying the values, aspirations, and enduring spirit of the nation. Through the ongoing efforts to maintain and protect this iconic building, we can rest assured that it will continue to tell the American story to future generations, serving as a beacon of democracy and a cornerstone of our national heritage. Which White House or executive residence did you like the best? Let me know down below in the comments section. And while you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.